The next thing I'd like to talk with you about is how some of the simple, innocent, everyday grammar mistakes that we all make can actually have a pretty profound impact on the interpretation of your written work, and therefore the interpretation of your ideas. So the first example I'd like to give is a word we are probably all familiar with: irregardless. June Casagrande, in her novel Mortal Syntax, states simply, don't use it. Use regardless instead. Now, why would she say that? That's because irregardless is thought to have come from two words. Regardless, which means that you don't really care, and irrespective, which means it doesn't really matter. And so we end up with irregardless. Now, what's really happening here is you're creating a double negative. Ir means not, and less means not. So you're really saying you do actually care, regarding. What most people actually are trying to say when they use the word irregardless is irrespective, which means it doesn't matter one way or the other. It is irrespective. The next example I'd like to give is an illustration of how simple grammar mistakes can really actually have a pretty profound impact on how your written work is perceived by the reader. So take, for example, two academic papers written about the same topic. One of them has been proofread, and all of the simple grammar slip-ups have been corrected. Punctuation's in the right place. They're using the correct form of there, the correct form of affect, etc. The reader is able to read this paper naturally. It flows well, and they're able to focus on what's being discussed in the paper. On the other hand, the paper that hasn't been proofread, or at least not as thoroughly, may be harder for the reader to actually decipher what the sentences are trying to prove, what points they're trying to make, and so they focus more on the writing and not on the topic, not on the idea. Another example, in 2009, a U.S. District Court judge in Florida actually threw out a motion by a prosecuting attorney because of grammar errors. He said it was so riddled with unprofessional grammatical errors that it made it almost incomprehensible. Now, I know that grammar is not everyone's first choice for an exciting topic, but this stuff does actually matter, and it can have a real impact. The last example I'd like to give is what's known in the literary world as the dangling participle, and that's just a fancy way of saying a sentence that's out of order logically. This doesn't actually have to do with punctuation or misspelled words or anything like that. It's more of a logical flow of the sentence from the beginning to the end. So here's an example. After rotting in the cellar for weeks, my brother brought up some oranges. Now, what you might think if you just read that fast is that there were some oranges in the basement that your brother brought up that were rotting. But if you look at the sentence carefully, what you're actually saying is that your brother was in the basement rotting, and then he brought up some oranges. What you really actually probably wanted to say was that your brother brought up some oranges that had been rotting in the cellar for weeks. This is just a simple example of how the order of your sentence, the construction, can actually have a significant impact on how it's interpreted. That example was from Brian Clark, who runs a very humorous blog called Copy Blogger. That was a post from back in March. So over the last few minutes, we've briefly touched on some of the most simple grammatical slip-ups that we all make. And the point of this presentation is really just to get a foot in the door. The best way to start fixing a problem is to recognize that there is one. And you, me, a lot of people just don't even give a second thought to this kind of stuff, and it really can make a very big impact. It can really set your writing ahead of other people, just by paying attention to a couple easy to fix grammar errors. And it really is the quickest and simplest way to improve your writing.